Hello, Alan. It's really good to see you once again, and it's very kind of you that you taken time off to speak to us and to our students. That's the most important thing, to speak to our students. And I hope this association carries on for a long, long time.
So do I. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Okay, so this is part of our MA course. It's a course which we call stylistics, or language and style. And in fact, this video is called Language and Style. And what we want to do is give the students some basics about style and language. And so it's the MA students, and they've never encountered this kind of stuff before. So I think they're a little apprehensive. So we want you to make them comfortable. We've tried that in our print material, but we want you to make them comfortable with the video as well. So students love definitions, as you know. And so if you were to define style, how would you do so?
Well, let's try. Style is a very important concept, and perhaps the simplest way of understanding it is that it's about choice, that there are alternative ways of saying basically the same thing. And because we have those different alternatives available, we choose between them, and the particular one that we choose gives a particular flavour, and that's a style. So style is not so much about correctness and it certainly being incorrect. It's not necessarily about good style and bad style, which are often ways in which anxious students think about style. It's really about alternatives and choice, and that's the key idea to keep in mind about style.
Okay. So carrying forward from here, what role do you envisage for style study in the teaching of language and literature? Because we have both for our MA.
Well, my sense is that style is really one of the key concepts across language use generally. So it's equally important whether you're thinking about having a conversation and about thinking about literature. So it's one of those concepts that bridges. I mean, I think there are a number of them, but style is perhaps the key one. So let's maybe try and explain how that comes about. So we need to go back to that definition of style as choice and think from there. As you acquire a language, I mean, the first obstacle that you face is trying to make yourself understood in any way at all. You've got something to say, and you need to find simply one way of saying it. So you want to greet somebody, and the first thing you try to do is to work out the word that means hello, pleased to meet you. As you progress through language acquisition, then you realise that there are lots of different ways of greeting people, lots of different ways of thanking people, and that you can choose between them, and that there are differences between them, and not so much what function the words or the idioms present, but the social meaning. Are you being formal, informal, polite, respectful, comical, archaic, and that you learn to manipulate those choices. So in the early stages of language development or language acquisition, people are anxious because they're worried that they can't find a single way of saying something. In intermediate and advanced stages, the real issue is about selecting between the alternatives that are available. Let's give another simple example. It would never occur to anyone sitting at a meal to say, please pass the sodium chloride. On the other hand, if you're in a science laboratory or a science class, salt is no longer the appropriate word, and sodium chloride becomes the phrase that you need. Now that's the difference between technical and non-technical. And by switching the phrases around, by saying please pass the sodium chloride, you can produce a comical effect.
Yes, you can produce a comical.
So the second key word, so just to complete that, to point in a way, the second key word is about appropriacy, or being appropriate to a situation. So as we make our stylistic choices, we make them targeted on our notion of what the situation is.
Yes, and this is actually talking about a larger socio-linguistic social environment. But our language is also our particular act of identity. And so there are differences in style from person to person. This is, we dress differently, do our makeup differently. So, because we want to project a certain identity to the world, so that we can get the best from the world and give the best ourselves to the world. So how do you sort of look at it in that sense?
I mean, you raised absolutely key concepts about style, really, which are about the relationship between our style and our identity. Take me, for instance. I'm not really much of a linguist. I'm not a speaker of many languages, except at very, very introductory levels. So if I go to a country, say France in my case is a very close-by country, I know enough French to be able to do various things, but I don't have the alternative ways of expressing things that enable me to manipulate style. Now, what does that mean for the way that I'm perceived? I'm perceived something as a robot because I can communicate these particular meanings, but I don't have personality. I can't develop a relationship with someone by showing that I'm now being more friendly or less formal. I can't shape myself as a person. And equally, of course, people can't perceive me as a person. So I become very one-dimensional. Part of what style does for us with clothing, with the way we think about our homes, or many of the choices that we make, what we eat, what we do, all of those alternatives say things about our identity. Language is a particularly rich and sophisticated system for doing that, so the styles that we adopt do make very important semiotic or sign statements about ourselves, the way we would like to be seen. And that's really, again, why the word appropriate is very important in relation to style, that we match the way we want to be seen in a situation with the linguistic resources that we know we can use to fit that situation. So if we want to be formal, we use formal choices. If we want to be very friendly, we use very friendly choices, and so on.
Yeah, so this is at the social level, and then it is sort of expanded much more at the literary level, and we'll talk about that as well. But nevertheless, there are certain basic features of style that students need to know. So would you sort of help them, just pretend that you're a teacher and you have to explain these concepts, some of the basic stuff that they just need to know. Would you just like to hold forth and for a while on this?
I mean, I'll try. The precise boundary between style and grammar and vocabulary isn't a clear one, and that doesn't really help students. But let's say that you're in a situation where you can now create sentence structures, you can pick words. Then the next challenge, as I've said, is that you have to choose the kind of sentence structures that you use and the vocabulary that you use. So if you take a sentence like, the dog ate the bone, we can manipulate that sentence in a range of ways. So we can say the bone was eaten by the dog, what the dog did was eat the bone, it was the dog that ate the bone, what the dog did was eat the bone, a whole range of other things which manipulate grammatical possibilities, active, passive, cleft sentences, pseudo-cleft sentences. We can manipulate word order, and then within that sentence we can shift words. So instead of saying the dog, we could say the hound. Refers to the same thing, has a different social meaning. So those are ways in which we manipulate style. How does someone ever really grasp that? Well, I think one way is that they have to think about where you get variety in language from. So you get some variety because of who you are, what background you have, and we call that generally dialect. You use different grammatical structures and different vocabulary because you happen to come from a different place, or a different gender group, ethnic group, or regional group, or in some cases professional group, such as army or police. But then there's another kind of variation which is just the way you speak, that would be accent. And then there's another kind of variation which is to do with the situations that we're in, and we usually call that register variation.
Okay, so the three main concepts that you've talked of, and that is in the book's students, is dialect, accent, and register. And Alan's explained that very nicely, and please go back to your notes in the book, and that it's explained there as well. Then literary work. Style is used quite differently there. Yes, dialect, accent really not so much, but dialect would probably come in there. We do have words of that kind. Hopkins, I think, used it in a very interesting fashion. And then how would style sort of fit in there?
I mean, we tend to say, as you said, we tend to say that style functions very differently in literature. But let's just think about that for a moment, because I'm not so convinced that it's true. Literary forms are simply situations in which you choose a language to write in. And they're relatively formal forms, they're public forms, they're written forms. And each of those facts about them rather shapes the language we use. So typically you wouldn't use the colloquial language of conversation in writing an elegy or some other very formal poetic form. So it's the same set of decisions that you're making actually in literary writing, that there are conventions of the situation and that you make stylistic choices to fit the convention. And that really is what shapes the conventions of literary forms. And in fact, if you look back in writing in English, those conventions have at different times been expressed with different degrees of formality and strictness, so that at some times it would have been just thought impossible. It would have been thought a complete break of protocol and decorum to use certain kinds of words in a particular style. However, once you've got those conventions, it's like any other convention. You can break it for a particular effect. So in the same way that you can break a style convention of clothing, so let's say I could turn up for today in a t-shirt instead of a jacket and a tie, and that would say something about my interpretation of the situation or how I would like to project myself. In the same way that a poet can then say, well, I'm going to write a sonnet, but I'm not going to use the formal language of sonnets, which has for a long time been conventionally respected. I'm simply going to use a different kind of language, and that's going to tell people that what I want to do with the sonnet is to make it comic or ironical, or to say that the sonnet is an over-formal form, or make some other statement. And literature is full of a whole range of experiments of that kind. I mean, perhaps another very interesting example, I think, in the history of writing in Britain, which is very interesting in global writing in English now, is about the use of dialect. If you look at dialect in a writer like, let's say, Thomas Hardy, or writers before Thomas Hardy, you had a whole range of dialect words, and you can find them in the footnotes that the editors explain what they mean. They're nearly always in the voice of minor characters, and they're in the voice of characters who are usually from the lower classes, and they're often in the mouths of characters who are from the countryside. That was a convention that you could use dialect words and dialect styles, but only in the voice of minor characters. The narrative voice, the narrator's voice, which carries authority and knowledge, was always in very standard English. It's only in the 20th century that you begin to get writers who say, well, I want to say something about myself. I'm a dialect speaker for either reasons of class or religion or whatever, and I'm going to project myself in the voice of the authoritative narrator in a dialect style. And I think that's a huge literary innovation, which merits a lot of thought and consideration, and which is very centrally about style. What styles fit what situations.
And why do you think that has happened? That in fact brings us very close to the, style and society and style and the social implications. So why do you think that has happened in the 20th century? Is it because man is different in the 20th, or a woman is different in the 20th century?
Yes, I mean, the reasons have to be very complicated, and it would be a rash person that jumped at one explanation of cause. I mean, one attractive line of thinking would be to say that before the 20th century we had a whole range of relatively fixed social hierarchies and social structures, and that language was an instrument of expressing our symbolic position in those structures. And so just in the same way that you had to speak respectfully to certain sorts of people, or speak authoritatively in order to maintain your position if you're at the other side of that transaction, so in literature you also kept things in place with these fixed structures. And in the 20th century there have been processes of democratization and liberalization, and that dialect expresses that. I'm not convinced that's the whole answer. I think that's part of the answer. I mean, there's another whole important dimension which I'm sure students would be interested in following up in relation to modernism in literature, where for reasons of trying to shock a literary bourgeoisie, for reasons of trying to go against tradition and have a sort of counteractive force or subversive force, people shifted the conventions. I mean, it's worth remembering, for instance, that one of the most studied poems in India as elsewhere T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And The Wasteland is full of a whole range of different sorts of voices from different classes. Got the poet's voice, archaic voices, literary voices, slang and colloquial voices. And in fact, Eliot's first title for the poem wasn't going to be The Wasteland at all. He was going to call that poem He Do the Police in Different Voices. It was conceived as a poem of mimicry of voices. So you have one of the main central documents of modernism there as being partly about manipulating or producing a counterpoint between these different sorts of social voices. And exactly what the relationship between the literary aspects of modernism and the sort of social collapse that surrounds the First World War, it's difficult to disentangle those causes, but certainly there are some very thought-provoking things and opportunities for further work for students to explore issues of style at that period.
We had Benjamin Zephaniah recently, who talked of Eliot, and if you sort of, he's a performance poet, and as you know, his poetry is absolutely simple. I mean, there's a lot of Eliot which is simple but very obscure, and I'm talking now in terms of obscurity versus extreme simplicity. What do you make of that?
Well, there's a whole set of challenges that poetry of Benjamin Zephaniah and others present to conventional conceptions of what poetry is. I mean, I suppose one way of starting to think about these issues is to say that in the post-war period, two directions have become more prevalent in at least Western poetry in English. One set of traditions has been esoteric, elitist, you might call it, academic, full of density, often obscure cultural references, and a sort of abstraction away from social engagement. Poetry not as a popular activity, but poetry as an intensely reflective social elite form. Another tradition has been the tradition in which really Benjamin Zephaniah has a major place, which has been the tradition of saying, well, look, poetry has lost its relationship to performance, to singing, to the spoken word, and that by adopting traditional forms, ballad forms, pop forms, it's possible to recover that. Now, two things in the West have made that tradition much more forceful in the last 20, 30 years. One has been the migration and the shift and diversification of, let's say, the British population. So the contributions made by people from the Caribbean, for instance, bring with them a whole set of traditions of popular ballad, lyrical forms, and those produce performances and give expression to a whole set of cultural forms, histories and aspirations which were not there. The other thing, though, which is also worth mentioning, is that in the same period you get the sudden rise of massive sales of cassettes, then vinyl discs, then CDs, and all of those media forms which enable us simultaneously to get cheap and accessibly the written form and also a speech form or a performance form. And so you've now got a whole range of outlets for performance poets, which weren't there in the same way. Yes, you could give a reading and do a performance. You couldn't turn that into copyrights, royalties, or a fixed text. And so there was always this special prestige of the written word. Whereas now, it's not so clear, is it, really, whether the ultimate or ideal text that you would want to produce is going to be a book. Is it going to be a video? Is it going to be a CD? And one thing, for instance, that I'm involved in at the moment is doing an edition of Tess of the D'Urbervilles for students for Penguin. It will have the usual editorial machinery, the footnotes, the biography. But interestingly, it will have a CD that goes with it, and the CD will have somebody performing the novel. And that reflects the great popularity of speaking books, audio cassette novels, and also students' expectations that they want to hear. They want to see performance. They're used to stories on film, stories on video. So you get that shift as well. And Benjamin Zephaniah, I think, is a very important popular exponent of those traditions. But just as one footnote, if I can add to that, there is nevertheless a social challenge to the conventional institutions of poetry which a writer and performer like Benjamin Zephaniah offers. So, he first came to prominence in Britain in a very particular situation, not as he should have done, because he's a wonderful, gifted, inspiring performer and educationalist who does a lot of work with children, but because he was nominated for a writer-in-residence position at Trinity College, Cambridge, and was not given it in circumstances which suggested that people thought that the populism of his writing, the simplicity of his writing, the very features that you drew attention to, were things that made this not proper poetry, and that brought him to the front page of the tabloid newspapers for a period.
If we could get into a further discussion on this whole business of change that is happening in poetry, for instance, or in novels now, since we're going to even perform tests in a sense. So from the book to the media, to the visual media maybe. To get back to some dry stuff of style, which inevitably students feel that they're forced to get into, and which they don't like, is this whole business of statistics and style. What do you think of it? Should we emphasize it in our courses? Should we downplay it? We're still in the process of writing, so it's advice to us, it's advice to the students.
Well, let me try and bring those things together, because I know students might say, well, there's an opposition here between the dry stuff of style and styling our studies, and then there's this other social topic which is about novels in the media. One stylistic dimension of novels in the media, which is absolutely central, is that one of the major stylistic distinctions is between the styles of speech and the styles of writing. There's a little dispute about exactly what the stylistic differences are.
But let's get into that for us to...
Let's get into that in a bit more detail. Let's try and move that towards the kinds of things that you asked about statistics and the things that the students do. It seems quite clear that there are differences between writing and speech, and they're very evident when people write emails, that emails are somehow halfway between speech and writing, and so they're stylistically not like formal letters. So there's an issue of formality. There's also an issue of grammaticality. I mean, anyone listening to this tape now who wants to go through it slowly will realise that neither you nor I speak in grammatical sentences most of the time. It's very difficult to speak in grammatical sentences, and it's not normal. If we do speak in grammatical sentences throughout this discussion, we will sound very dry and very unusual as speakers.
Can I just jump in for a moment? Is that the problem that which second language learners have? Because we tend to be, I remember, this is something which we debate with the teachers all the time, is that what is your name? My name is so and so, and they expect you to answer in complete sentences. This is something that we sort of quarrel with the school teachers when we do our teacher training, and they expect absolutely grammatical sentences, and they expect complete sentences and answers. So what is your... so this is something that they should be aware of.
Yes, they should certainly be aware of it. I can understand very much why it happens. It's part of a tradition in which writing took precedence over speech, and in which correctness was very important, has been very important, it remains very important, but the notion of correctness needs to be related to the notion of what's appropriate. So, it's ridiculous if you were to say, well, I want to develop my conversational skills, and so I'm going to learn to do that by imitating the style of the great 19th century prose essayists. So when I talk to you about what sort of day it's been, but we then talk in the style of very complex subordinated sentences like an essay. And yes, the teaching and study of language has to move much more to the idea that spoken language is different, that it's part of social action more generally. But the ways we interact are partly with our hands, partly with our faces, partly with words, and that the words are just one component of a social interaction. So actually we really need to move much more towards thinking about how we interact socially using words among other signs.
Okay, so
not about correct sentences.
Yeah, and so one of the points, now we will point twice for our students, was that we don't particularly speak grammatically when we speak to each other. And you as a native speaker and me as a second language speaker, who is also a teacher of English, will have many ungrammatical sentences as we go.
There's nothing to worry about.
And it's something we shouldn't, sort of edit the whole tape out for okay. So what are the other differences between spoken and the written?
Well, the differences, people argue about the differences, and this is the point I want to come on to in a minute, which is about statistics. One of the traditional differences that's usually thought of is that there's much more grammatical complexity in writing than in speech.
Mm-hmm.
So in speech we just have a thought, we say it, we string the next one on the end like beads on a string. Whereas in most styles of writing, not in all styles of writing, but most, we then tend to model our sentences in ways which involve a lot of relative clauses, adverbial clauses, and so a lot of embedding and relative complexity. And that produces a very different style. So there's your style difference. You know, that there's completeness and there's also complexity.
Mm-hmm.
There are other differences, like we use pause fillers,
yes.
we give each other so-called back-channel feedback by nodding, by various some verbal, some non-verbal sounds which we make to encourage and reassure and support each other. I mean, that's all that conversational behaviour is very different from writing on the page. There are a range of differences which you can analyse, and this is what brings us to the business of style and statistics. How would you go about analysing them? Well, you'd have to take some samples and then examine the samples carefully. If you just took one type of text, one piece of text, and one small segment of conversation, you wouldn't really have a representative instance. So if you took 5 minutes of a lecture, a public lecture, which was spoken, it's quite likely it would have been spoken from a written text. It's very formal. It would probably be much closer to written forms than if you took two people talking on the street corner, or talking while they watch the television. So obviously to study these things you need to take larger samples, and then you need to identify segments and count segments, and that's what takes you then to the statistics. And that's one way of beginning to work out what the actual styles of different forms are, is to take large amounts of them and then examine their typical properties. So, and you can then of course do that for individuals, and I'm sure that's what we'll probably go on to talk about in a moment. And yes, you can do this for language in social use generally, but in a literary application you could then say, well, what is the difference between one writer and another? And you would find that, at least it has been argued very extensively, that there are differences in terms of one writer having a preference.
It was wonderful talking to you, and I'm sure our students would have picked up a lot of stuff from you. We look forward to you coming again next year, maybe, and we'll then pick up another issue that would interest us and interest our students. Thank you so much.
Thank you.